Hello, dear friends. Today I'm going to talk about the poem Death of a Leveler by James Shirley. So, James Shirley was an English poet and dramatist who is known today as one of the leading playwrights in the decade before the closing of theatres by Parliament in 1642. He was born in September 1596, London, and was buried on October 29, 1666. Talking about Death of the Leveler, it is a philosophical poem that deals with the themes of man's mortality, the transience of life, pride, honor, and the immortality of virtue. The poem's central idea revolves around the universal truth of death being a great leveler, as it renders all the societal distinctions of class, ability, power completely immaterial. Composed in three stanzas, the poem has a rhyme scheme of AB, AB, CC, DD, which adds a melancholic melody to this dirge or lament sung by Calchas. Moving on to stanza 1, the glories of our blood and state are shadows, not substantial things. There is no armor against fate. Death lays his icy hand on kings. Scepter and crown must tumble down, and in the dust be equal made with the poor crooked scythe and spade. So the poem begins on a note that the physical glories of one's body and one's power and property are not material things but mere shadows. The wealth and status that we so tirelessly pursue cannot ever save us from death's ambush. Death looms over all of us, regardless of our class or creed. The king and his subjects are both made equal in death. The pride that we take in the materialistic symbols of power and status is ephemeral. These are armors which are useless in the face of death, and they are like mere shadows that cannot shield us against death. The armor here refers to the armor and shield of Achilles. The shield of Achilles is one of the most important objects of Homer's Iliad and was said to represent civilization and indeed the entire world order. However, even this powerful armor is useless when faced with death. Death the Leveler is a poem replete with literary devices. If you look at the metaphor icy hand to denote the cold, lifeless effect death has on whoever it touches. Contrast this with the warm nature of blood, the glory of which is said to be a shadow in the opening of the poem. Death does not spare the power and glory that the kings have. These are represented by the scepter, the power, and the crown representing glory. Both must tumble down in the end. Here we see the use of metonymy when the poet uses scepter and crown to symbolize power and glory, respectively. These two powerful symbols of the rulers, often the oppressors, must turn to dust and must be made equal to the poor, crooked scythe and spade, the tools which are used by the ruled and oppressed poor peasants to till the land and reap the harvest. For death, the royalty and the peasantry are both alike. Here we see Shirley's masterful use of contrast to represent different classes of people by using the scepter and the crown on the one hand and the scythe and the spade on the other. One also witnesses the use of alliteration, scythe and spade, in the last line of the first stanza. So Shirley opens the poem by stating that all earthly glories of power and property are insignificant in front of death. They have no real value, although we regard them to be the most important aspect of our lives. Death does not discriminate between the king and his subjects. There is no armor that can stop the icy hand of death from touching the king or his subjects. So the power and glory of the state falls down and it is leveled to the ground by death. Similarly, the victor and the vanquished are leveled alike by death. The attributes or characteristics of death as a just, unbiased leveler is presented wonderfully through skillful imagery throughout the poem. So the title, Death of the Leveler, is very apt because it portrays a central theme. The predominant tone of Death the Leveler is one of fatalism, as the poet stresses the inevitability of death. However, there is a sense of poetic justice at the end of the first stanza when the poet shows how kings and farmers are made equal in death. In the second stanza, the tone subtly changes from one of valiant victory in the battle to that of the piteous surrender to death. Only in the last lines of the poem is there a tone of hope, a tone of optimism, when the poet asserts that man's good deeds will never die. Everybody must bow before death. Therefore, it is better to cast aside our vanity, our pride, and focus on the true virtues of life instead of the futile endeavors we undertake to attain hollow glories. Moving on to stanza 2. Some men with swords may reap the field and plant fresh laurels where they kill, but their strong nerves at last must yield. They tame but one another still. Early or late, they stoop to fate and must give up their murmuring breath when their pale captives creep to death. So, in the second stanza, the poet talks about the warrior class who help sustain the state of the king mentioned in the first stanza. These powerful conquerors attack other lands, winning laurels and praise for their bravery. These men are said to reap the field with swords, meaning they cut the head of their rivals like cutting the heads of crops in the field. So this technique of using an expression in place of that may be found unpleasant or harsh is known as euphemism. This use is made effectively as we see that in the stanza immediately before this, the poet had used the image of the scythe, a tool which is used to cut the crops during harvest. Eventually, the victors too become a part of the same bloodshed. They too have to kneel before providence and accept their demise, and that is sooner or later. The use of pun in line 4 of the second stanza, where the word still denotes both ineffectiveness and death. So in the second stanza, the poet tells people with power achieve many things. For instance, king with swords will conquer new places. He will exert his dominance over the newly conquered place. For achieving victory, sometimes the king have to kill some men. Even if they are powerful, they will face death sooner or later. So there is a shift of tone in the second stanza from valiant victories to poignant surrender. The use of transferred epithet can be seen in murmuring breath in line 7 of this stanza. We find that the poet says that nobody can defeat death with their swords. Ultimately, they become powerless like a prisoner who's living in a jail. In stanza 3, the poet states, "The garlands wither on your brow, then boast no more your mighty deeds. Upon death's purple altar now, see where the victim bleeds. Your heads must come to the cold tomb. Only the actions of the just smell sweet and blossom in their dust." So in the third stanza, the poet tells us that even if a man boasts his mighty deeds, achievements and rewards, which he has got in his entire life, those will disappear once he leaves from this world. So death does not pay attention to these. Even a great victorious man becomes a victim when he faces death. He cannot defeat death. In the end, all become part of the earth and become dust. According to the poet, what remains is one's good actions, which one has done in one's entire life. So his action will give him fame. So as the poem ends, we get an image of a lamb who's taken to the altar uh, as a sacrificial lamb, and the sacrificial lamb does not know that it will die soon. So, in the poem, the man will also sacrifice his life in front of death's purple altar. The only note of hope and optimism is seen in the last few lines when the poet states that though everything else might be forgotten, the good deeds done by man shall always continue. It is only the good deeds that will spread the fragrance long after the person is gone. Thank you.